Good morning, everyone. I'm Meredith Dankos. I'm the lead pastor here at The Well. Welcome. If you are watching us online or on the app, go ahead and fill out your digital Connect card and let us know you're here. If you're in person, you can also fill out the digital Connect card on your phone. Let us know how to pray for you and what your next step is, what you might need more information on. So we're kicking off our new series on Joseph, and I love the story of Joseph. But I wanted to start off with talking about my husband first, my husband Steve, who you met a little bit earlier in the service. So maybe you are married to someone like this. Steve is quick to get rid of things, like very quick to get rid of things. Like sometimes when you're looking around for something, you're like, where could that be? And finally I'm like, I wonder if Steve got rid of it. And I ask him, he's like, yeah, I got rid of that. And it was really extreme when we first got married. He's toned it down a bit. But within like the first couple months of being married, we've been married now 19 years, so he's learned. But in that first few months, one of our light bulbs burned out on our lamp. And so I went to the closet where you keep the spare light bulbs, and there were none there. And I was like, where did our light bulbs go? And I turned to Steve, like, do you know where our spare light bulbs went? And he goes, I threw them out. We weren't using them. And I was like, that's the whole point of a spare light bulb, is you are not using it, and it is available for when you need it. So he's very quick to just toss things sometimes. And he's also what's known as a late adopter. You know, some of you are this too, where you're like, until like everyone on the planet is using that, there's no way that I'm going to do that. And so we stayed with my parents for an extended period of time during the pandemic. And Steve became a convert to the Sponge Daddy. Has anyone ever used a Sponge Daddy? Right? So he was like going on and on about how much he loves the Sponge Daddy. And my mother turns to him and she goes, well, you know that I sent you one of those 2 years ago for Christmas. And he's like, both of us are like, oh no, because Steve got rid of it is what happened. He didn't see a use for it, so he got rid of it. And I'm like, how's he going to answer this one? He goes, well, I'm a convert now. So, you know, he's quick. If he doesn't see a use for it, it doesn't stay around our house very long. But here's the good news. Here's the good news that I want to share with you today. God is not like Steve. God is not like Steve, right? God, and I asked him if I could say that. So, God is not quick to get rid of things, right? God is not quick to get rid of things. We're going to be in the book of Genesis for the next 5 weeks, and that's basically the whole point of Genesis, is that God is not quick to get rid of things. In fact, you could sum Genesis up like this. Just because we can't see a use for it doesn't mean that it's useless when it comes to God. Just because we can't see a use for it doesn't mean that it's useless, because God will use anyone and anything to bring about his promise of rescue and redemption. And we see that over and over again. So let's dive in to the story of Joseph. And if you have not, I'm just going to say this on the front end, if you have not read Genesis before or you've not read Genesis lately, it would be worth it this week to go and read it, because you're going to get a lot of context. I'm going to give you like a really broad brush overview, but there's a lot of history that helps make sense of the story of Joseph. So again, Joseph comes at the end of the book of Genesis. So like any good story, you kind of have to know what happened before it to really get what's going on here. So I'm going to sum up the first 36 chapters very quickly for you. So Genesis means origins, it means beginning, and it tells the story, the beginning of humanity, but even more so, it tells the origin of the nation of Israel and how Israel came to be about. And so we start off in Genesis in a garden, and we see God's perfect creation for humanity, and then we see what's known as the fall, where humanity reaches for the fruit that they're told not to. They choose to go their own way and not God's way, and then we see God promise to rescue. God promised to bring about redemption, and how he goes about that, because Genesis just gets kind of worse and worse and worse, and things, we have murder and war and strife, and then God calls a man. He calls Abraham, and he says, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. And Abraham is old, and he doesn't have children, and he's married to someone who's old, and they laugh, and they think, how is this possible? But eventually, Abraham he is the father of Isaac. And Isaac is the chosen son to carry on this line of promise. But as we'll see over and over again, Isaac is the chosen son, but Abraham has another son, Ishmael, and Ishmael is sent off. Ishmael is discarded. And then from Isaac marries Rebekah, and they have two sons, Esau and Jacob. And we're told that Jacob loved Esau, but did not love Jacob, that he favors Esau, but Rebekah, his wife, favors Jacob. So now we've got like scheming within the family. And what happens is Jacob, his name means deceiver, and he's pretty deceptive. He fools Esau into giving over his birthright, and then he fools his own father, Isaac, into giving him the blessing that is intended for Esau. And so Jacob has to flee for his life, and he runs away. And then during that time, he wrestles with God, and he is renamed Israel. And Israel means one who contends with God. So that's where we get the name of the nation of Israel. So you'll hear throughout the whole Bible that God is the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. And if you go back and read those stories, you'll see, oh, these are the patriarchs of this nation. They're not great. They're not awesome. They're not people that you're like, you should be like them. No, you probably should not. They make mistake after mistake after mistake. But these are the people that God chooses to use to bring about his rescue plan. God is not like Steve. He's not quick to get rid of things, right? He's like, all right, we're going to use these broken people. And from that, we get the story of Joseph. So now, Jacob is Joseph's father, which means Isaac is Joseph's grandfather, and Abraham is Joseph's great-grandfather. So when he's hearing the stories of Isaac and he's hearing the stories of Abraham, those are his family. Like, they're a close family. This is how we're introduced to Joseph. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel, who is Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other brothers because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Okay, so this is a loaded introduction here, and we need a little bit of background to understand what's happening. Because in Joseph's, if you think your family's a mess, you are going to feel so much better after you leave this here today, okay? Because Joseph is Jacob's son. Jacob actually has 4 wives, okay? 4 wives. And how Jacob ended up with 4 wives is Jacob fell madly in love with a woman named Rachel, and he was desperate to marry her. And so her father said, well, you have to work for me for 7 years before you can marry Rachel. And so Jacob worked for 7 years for Laban, and then Laban tricked him and had him marry Leah instead, her older sister. And we're told that Jacob did not love Leah, right? And so Jacob is distraught. He's like, this is the wrong lady. What did you do? So Laban says, well, how about you work for me for another 7 years, and then you can marry Rachel? And he's like, okay, deal. So Jacob is madly in love with Rachel, but there's all this strife between the 2 sisters, and Leah is able to have children, and she has 4 sons, and Rachel is not able to have children. And so what does Rachel do? She gives him Bilhah, her handmaid, who's now a concubine of Jacob, to have children in her stead. And then when Leah can't have children anymore, she gets jealous, so she gives him Zilpah, her handmaid, who is now Jacob's concubine, and she has children as well. And then Rachel finally has 2 children of her own at the end, Joseph and Benjamin. Benjamin is Joseph's younger brother. He'll play a big role in this story later as we go, but in giving birth to Benjamin, Rachel dies. So Jacob's beloved wife is now dead, and so you've got 4 wives, 12 sons, an untold number of daughters, and it's a big mess, right? And they're all contending with each other. The wives have strife, which carries down into the children. So we're told that Joseph is out tending the sheep with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Those are the 2 concubines of Jacob. And Joseph would be the youngest there, so he would be in a role of serving the older brothers, doing all the menial work. So what does Joseph do? He comes back and he gives a report of his brothers. We're told he gives a bad report. And that could be like, oh, he's telling on them because they did bad things. But that word, bad report in Hebrew, is often translated as slander. It's like they might have been doing something bad, but it's malicious. It's a malicious report. Like he's tattling, but he's either fabricating it or he's exaggerating it in order to make it worse. And that's really disconcerting for these brothers of Joseph because they're the brothers of the concubine. So they already have a lower status. And then Joseph comes along and he says, well, let me tell you some bad stuff about this. So makes them mad. And then what does Jacob do? Jacob goes and makes him a fancy robe. And sometimes we're told it's a robe of many colors. That wouldn't really be, they couldn't really make a robe of many colors back then. They didn't have dyes the way that we do, but it's an ornate robe. And it's a robe that would go from all the way, a long sleeve, all the way down to your ankle. It's a robe that's not meant for manual labor, right? So now Joseph, who was supposed to be in the servant role, because he's the youngest, is now elevated to what would be a manager. And what we're seeing is he's the favored son. He's the one who Jacob is now saying, I'm going to put him first, which would mean that he would get the double portion of the inheritance. And this makes all of the brothers mad, especially Leah's sons, because Leah's sons are the oldest, right? And so they're first in line. But a lot of them have kind of forfeited their right to the inheritance. So Reuben, who is the firstborn, and Reuben will play a role in this story in a moment. Reuben, who's the firstborn, well, he lost the respect of his father because he slept with Bilhah, right? So he slept with his father's concubine, now he's out. And then Simeon and Levi, who are right behind Reuben, sons of Leah, should be in line for this inheritance. Their sister was raped in the town of Shechem, and Jacob didn't do anything, so what did they do? They went and massacred everyone. They murdered all of them. And so Jacob is distraught that not what happened to his daughter, but you're going to bring trouble onto our house. So we've got some murderous guys. We've got a guy who just doesn't have any scruples. And so now what they're seeing is, Joseph, who is the firstborn of the favored wife, is now going to be first in line in inheritance. So he should be way back in the line. He's going to be first. So now his brothers have all this enmity. And we're told they can't speak a kind word. It says they could not say a word of shalom to him. They could not say a word of peace at all. There's no peace. And then it gets worse, okay? And this is what we're told. Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. And his brother said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. And so these brothers, you can see the anger building, right? Because now Joseph's already been put in this favored position. And I bet you, all of us, anyone who's a sibling of with other people, if you get something that your other siblings didn't, you're not I'm going to hide that. If you're the favorite in the moment, you're I'm the favorite, right? And so I'm pretty sure Joseph is wearing that coat all the time, right? And so his brothers already see that he has favored status, and now he's having this dream where it's all of you are going to bow down to me. Isn't that amazing? And they hate him even more. And you think, he's not unaware of the fact that they can't speak kindly to him, that they're angry. And so what happens? He has another dream. And what does he do? He goes and tells them. He says, then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. Listen, he said, I had another dream. And this time, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. So there's 11 brothers. Sun and moon would represent his mother and father. And when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. And so the second dream not only includes the brothers, it includes his parents. And this is a pretty scandalous scene that Joseph is telling them, because in a patriarchal society, parents did not bow down to children, right? There's the honoring of your elders. And so at first, Jacob's wait a second, no. But he holds on to it. Why? Because Jacob himself is a recipient of dreams from the Lord that meant something, and he knows this legacy of the promised child, because up until this point, there's been one son that carries on the promise, right? There's been one son that's going to build the nation from. We're going to see that changes with this story as we go along, but Jacob's got that in the back of his mind. Oh, maybe Joseph is the promised one. He's the one, just like me, who's going to carry on in this story. But the brothers hear it, and they're jealous, and they hate him all the more. And so you can sense that something terrible is building, right? Something really bad is about to happen. You can't have this much anger and hate and strife and not eventually have it boil over. And eventually it does. So the brothers, we're told, are out. They're tending the sheep near Shechem. And if that sounds familiar, remember Shechem is where Levi and Simeon had destroyed a whole town in vengeance for their sister. And they're tending the sheep in Shechem. And Jacob calls Joseph to him. He says, I want you to go out, check on your brothers, and bring me a report. Okay? And he has good reason to be concerned, because there's strife there. And we know that the brothers don't always make good decisions. So Joseph goes out. and he's going to find them, and he can't find them, and then he meets a stranger, and the stranger directs him to where they are, and the brothers see him a distance away, because to be really clear, Shechem is 50 miles north of where they live. So this is a 5-day journey that Joseph has just been sent off on his own. And he said, sure, I'll go out and do that. And from a distance, his brothers see him, and this is what they say. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. Let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So Reuben has this plan of like, maybe if they don't kill him, then I can take him back and I'll get in my dad's good graces. And so Reuben convinces them to throw him into a cistern. And these cisterns were like bottle-shaped giant pits. Sometimes it says let's throw him into this pit. And they were these bottle-shaped pits that were meant to collect water. And so if you got into one, you couldn't climb out of it. So he says, let's just leave him here. We won't kill him. Like, we won't shed his blood. We'll just leave him here to die of thirst, hunger, and exposure. Like, that's much better, right? And so that's the plan. And then we are told this as he comes along. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. And there's a callousness to this account, because we're told that they jumped on him and stripped his robe, and that word stripped is the same word used to skin an animal, right? So this is a violent attack that's just happened. So they have beaten up their brother, they've stripped him of this ornate robe that is just a source of anger and enmity, and they throw him in the cistern, and then they look up and they see this caravan of Ishmaelites. And if you remember, Ishmael is the son that was discarded from Abraham. So these are like ancient, descendants that we're not really associated with anymore. And the Ishmaelites are coming, and Judah looks up and he has a plan. And he says this. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And the others agreed. So they're in the middle of eating lunch after they've just beaten up their brother, thrown him in a cistern, leaving him there to die. They look up and Judah's like, I know, let's sell him instead. And so they do. They sell him for 20 shekels of silver, which is the going rate of a slave, right? So they take their brother and they sell him as a slave. And then Reuben comes back. We don't know why Reuben was gone, but Reuben comes back because Reuben had the plan to rescue Joseph, and he sees that he's gone, and we're told when Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" And that's a really important question, because Reuben doesn't say, where is he? How can we go and rescue him? How could we have done this to our brother? He says, where can I turn now? And we see that Reuben's intention all along was not any concern for Joseph. It was all about, if I am the brother who saves Joseph, my father's favorite son from all the other brothers, maybe I will be restored to my rightful place. Maybe I will be forgiven. Where can I turn now? But he can't turn anywhere. And so the brothers come up with this plan. And they take the coat, and they slaughter a goat, and they cover it in the goat's blood, and they bring it back to their father, and they say to him, "Look at this. Could this possibly be your son's coat?" Notice they don't say our brother's coat, your son's coat. And they feign ignorance. Like, we just happen to find this. They don't tell him a story. They just give him enough information to let Jacob draw his own conclusions. And when Jacob sees what happens, he sees his coat, it says he recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." And then Jacob tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." And so his father wept for him. And so if the brothers thought, if we just get Joseph out of the way, if he's not just caught up with this favorite son, then maybe he will turn his affections back to us. But that's not what happens. In fact, their decision undermines everything they want because they lose what little left they had of their father. There's no comforting Jacob. He's distraught, and he says, I will not be at peace until I'm reunited with my son in the grave. And so everything they hoped would happen is just completely destroyed. And we're told at the end of this chapter that Joseph is sold into slavery in the house of Potiphar, which we will read about that next week. But imagine Joseph. He started his day. He was clothed as a prince, right? And royalty, thinking he's the best thing around. And by the end of the day, he's stripped, he's beaten, he's been thrown into a cistern, he's been betrayed, he's been sold into slavery. He's alone in a land where he doesn't know the language. He doesn't know a soul. He has no power, no position. There's no one to help him. This is a story of hate, and this is a story of tragedy. This is a terrible story. When we put ourselves in Joseph's position, we think this would be the worst thing. In fact, to sell someone into slavery at that time was the same. It was a capital offense. It was considered the same as murder because you have stolen someone's life from them, right? So this is a tragic story where we clearly see, and it helps, it's fitting in Genesis because Genesis introduces sin and shows us the snowballing of what sin does, and we see the accumulation of what sin can do in a family and in an individual. So it's a tragic story, but it's also a foundational story for the nation of Israel because hundreds of years later, Israel, Joseph is gone into Egypt. Israel is going to be enslaved in Egypt and is going to be delivered from Egypt, which is called the Exodus. And this is the story that creates the whole nation of Israel, that is foundational for their identity. God will say over and over again, I am the God who delivered you from slavery. Right? So this, Joseph ending up in Egypt is huge. But here's one of the things that happens is because it's so foundational, some people argue, because notice, God is not mentioned at all in that chapter. Not once. We don't mention God. They say, God's not mentioned, but God's doing everything. God has orchestrated all these events because God has to get Joseph into slavery in Egypt in order to create the nation of Israel. But if we step back from that, we would say, is God steering people towards evil and ill decisions in order to accomplish something? Does God really need Joseph to go and be removed from his family and beaten and sold into slavery? Is that what God needs to do to fulfill his purpose? And when we think that it is, we fall into what is known as the blueprint worldview. And the blueprint worldview is life is a blueprint, and it's all laid out. God is behind every single event. You might not understand the plan, but God understands the whole plan. And so you haven't made a single decision that God isn't behind, right? So God is behind all the good stuff, and God is behind all the bad stuff. And we might think that it's bad, but it might be good because God's behind it and God's doing it. And we think, okay, but that worldview falls short. It's incomplete because, yes, God is sovereign and God is always at work. There's nothing that God is not at work in. But the blueprint worldview assumes God is the only will at work. God is the only one that can will anything. But if you've been here for any period of time, you've heard me say that's not how God set up the world. God chose to say, he could have set up the world that way, that he just gets his way all the time, and that's it. But God chose to set up the world in a way that we get a say and spiritual forces get a say. And so we can choose against the will of God. God has made it so that he doesn't always get his way, that we don't always do what he wants, which is precisely what we see in this story, that we see people over and over again choosing not the way of God, but choosing their own way. And this is what's known as the conflict worldview. And the conflict worldview says that evil and good are in conflict. And even though evil has ultimately been defeated in Jesus, right now, it still has a say. Right now, it still has influence, and it's still at work. Greg Boyd says it really well. He says, it's one thing for God to use the evil intentions of people who have freely chosen evil, such as Pharaoh, Judas, and Joseph's brothers, but it's quite another thing for God to predestine people to have evil character or steer people to evil against their will. Scripture never records God doing the latter. though it provides many instances of God doing the former. So God does not cause or will evil intentions or actions. And we cannot hear that enough. God does not cause or will evil intentions or actions. That God is not behind sinful things. That's just not who he is. That's not consistent with who we see, especially who we see in Jesus. And that's the clearest picture of who God is. Jesus never uses sin to make a point. Jesus never uses something that is evil to make a point. Jesus opposes evil at every single turn. So that is inconsistent with God's character. But God is not like Steve. God is able to use anything, right? Just because you don't see a use for it doesn't mean it's useless when it comes to God. God is able to continually use broken people who make bad decisions over and over again to fulfill his purposes. Again, Greg Boyd says it like this: had the brothers' moral character developed differently, God would have had in place a different plan to get Joseph and them into Egypt. Because we finite humans cannot conceive of how God can accomplish his ends without coercion, some conclude that God must have planned the brothers' betrayal all along. So if God didn't will Joseph into slavery, what's happening in this story? Why is it playing out the way that it is? And what we see here are people using their will to choose sinful paths. Every single person in this character. Some people like to hold Joseph up as if like he was pure and blameless. No. Every single person is choosing to go their own way. It's what is often called the dark side of their personality. That's what Gary McIntosh and Samuel Rima in their book, Overcoming the Dark Side of Leadership, they call this the dark side of your personality. And they describe it this way. The dark side, though sounding quite sinister, is actually a natural result of human development. It is the inner urges, compulsions, and dysfunctions of our personality that often go unexamined and remain unknown to us. Right? And so the dark side is it's the shadows of your personality. It's the things that often you try to keep hidden or sometimes are unknown to yourself. You know, it's when we're not acting on our best behavior. And we all have it. It's just part of being human. And they say the way we get a dark side is we have the raw materials that go into fallen humanity. So we have pride, we have selfishness, and self-deception. Those three elements, pride, selfishness, self-deception, are just innate to all of us because we are infected with sin. But in addition to that, we have our experiences and our influences. And those together uniquely shape each of our dark side. And when we talk about our experiences and our influences, they can be the large tragedies in your life. If you had, parents get divorced or abuse or, substance abuse, any of those things, right? They can be the large tragedies, but they're also the small tragedies. The small traumas, like you didn't get invited to sit at the lunch table when you were middle school, right? Or a teacher made a passing comment to you, or a pastor said something, or a parent said something, or you just didn't measure up to your sibling, whatever that is. They're the large traumas and the small traumas, and all of those taken together create these wounds that sometimes we act out of and we lead out of, whether we realize it or not. And sometimes it's we're trying to prove something to ourselves or to others, or sometimes we're trying to avoid something. Like I'll never feel that again. I'll never be in that type of situation again. And when that takes root, and all of us have it, none of us are immune from it, it starts to create damage when we lead out of it. Here's some ways that your dark side can show up. It can be always needing to be in control. It can be pursuit of perfection, being status conscious, the need for admiration or acclaim, suspicion or jealousy of others, avoiding conflict, tolerating bad behaviors in others because you don't want to deal with it, right? Overachieving, overcommitting so as not to disappoint others, being passive-aggressive, complaining, undermining other people's efforts, all of those things. So everyone now is like, oh, I have one of those, I guess. I hope that, if you're immune to all of those, then good for you, but I'm not, right? And here's the thing. When your dark side is left unchecked, even someone who is the most successful person, who you look at and think, man, how would they ever mess up? They can be led into making an immoral choice, an unwise choice, an unethical choice, an impulsive choice, right? And suddenly you're making decisions and you're like, I didn't even see this coming. And again, they say, in short, any behavior that seems to overpower us as well as any urge or motivation that seems to uncontrollably drive us, is a possible sign indicating the presence of our dark side. Your dark side can drive you. Sometimes it's malicious, sometimes it's ignorant, but when it shows up, it doesn't always bring good stuff about. And that's what we see in the story of Joseph, is each person, no one is immune. Each one of them has given over to this dark side of their personality, and we see damage and hurt come out from it. So let's look at this. So we have to start with Jacob first, because Jacob's favoritism is what poisons the well. It is Jacob's favoritism that sets up the enmity, and he out of anyone should know better than this. Jacob, out of anyone, should know how painful it is to have a father choose one son and not the other, to feel loved by one person and not another. That is what happened to Jacob. Isaac chose Esau, and Jacob had to worm his way in there and try to get his father to bless him and care for him. And so what does he do? He passes that on. He passes that. He continues this generational sin. We saw it with Abraham, with Isaac and Ishmael. We see it with Isaac, with Jacob and Esau, and now Jacob is doing the same thing. And Jim Wilder talks about how each one of us have holes in our development, things that we didn't quite get. But he says over generations, they become cumulative because you can't pass on what you don't have. And so we just see it get worse and worse and worse as it goes along. So his favoritism does this, but also his ignorance and silence. And we see this over and over again with Jacob. When his daughter Dinah is raped, he doesn't say anything. He doesn't do anything. He wants to ignore it. When Reuben sleeps with his wife, Bilhah, it just says that he lost the respect of his father. He doesn't actually confront Reuben and try to make him better. Over and over again, he turns a blind eye to Simeon and Levi. He says, oh, you've done something really bad by murdering everyone, but then doesn't do anything about it. And then he sends Joseph out to check on his brothers all alone, 50 miles away, right? Without really opening up his eyes to say, there is bad stuff going on in my family. And so what we see in Jacob is his dark side when he's younger shows up in a malicious way, where he's deceptive and he's sneaky. And then in his old age, it shows up in this ignorant way, where he just chooses to stay blind. He chooses to be comfortable rather than actually address what's going on in his family. And the irony is, it is with a garment and a goat that he deceived his own father, and it is with a garment and a goat that he himself is deceived. And we just see these holes being passed down from generation to generation. And then we have Joseph's dark side, because Joseph is not innocent in this part of the story. Joseph's dark side shows up in arrogance and insensitivity, right? He tattles on his brothers. He's going around being like, hey, after he told the first dream, and he saw that he was angry, to tell the second dream, you're either foolish or malicious, right? It's one of those, but you're not smart. You're not reading the room, man. Take a step back, right? And so he's wearing his coat. He knows that he's the favorite. And even his arrogance shows up where he says, sure, I'll go out and see my brothers 50 miles away, 5 days away from you. I'm the favorite. What are they going to do, right? He just assumes he's untouchable. And so we see the raw materials there at work with Joseph of pride, of selfishness, and self-deception. Thinking, I know what's happening here, but he doesn't. And then we have his brothers. And when it comes to his brothers, this is where we see the malicious side of the dark side. And what's interesting is this story is written in such a way that you can understand the brothers' anger, because they have been told over and over again, you're dispensable. You're expendable. So when Jacob is going to see his brother Esau, who he has fled from, because Esau vowed to murder him, right? And he's coming back from leaving Laban, and he's terrified of what his brother's going to do. What does Jacob do? He sends Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah and all their children in front of them, and he keeps Joseph and Rachel behind in the safe place. And he didn't know what Esau was going to do. He said basically what he said to all of his other sons is, it's okay if you get murdered. It's okay. I'm going to send you out first. I don't know what's waiting you, and you go first, and if he kills you, great. Then I'll know what's happening, and I can keep the one that I love safe. So they've been told this message over and over again. And what they do is they start to feed on each other's anger and bitterness, and it grows more and more into hatred. And we see that they continue to make self-serving choices, because here's the thing. They have a reason to be angry and hurt, but reasons are not excuses. Reasons are not excuses. And hold on to that in your own life. Anyone who has hurt you, or when you've hurt someone else, you may have a reason. It doesn't excuse the behavior. It doesn't excuse that they work themselves up into violence and eventually betrayal of their brother. It doesn't excuse it, but we can understand how they got there. But over and over, they're self-serving because, when it comes to Reuben, he wants to save Joseph for himself. And even Judah wanting to get rid of Joseph, but not have anyone else look good, Judah then would be the next in line for the inheritance, right? Because the three in front of him, they're gone. They haven't been redeemed at all. So Judah's the one who might benefit from this situation. So we see self-serving decision after self-serving decision over and over again. And so all of them, every single person is living into this dark side, whether knowingly or unknowingly, and it creates destruction and harm and hurt over and over. And it seems like it jumps out of nowhere, but it's been building. It's been building. And again, McIntosh and Rima say it this way: at times, the dark side seems to leap on us unexpectedly. In reality, it has slowly crept up on us. The development of our dark side has been a lifetime in the making, despite the fact that the assault by these powerful emotions, compulsions, and dysfunctions can be sudden. And here's the thing about our dark side, is it's not quite as dramatic as we see with the brothers and Joseph and Jacob, right? Like, we're not selling people into slavery and, jumping them and throwing them into pits and all that. But when it goes unchecked in our own lives, it can be just as destructive. And I know because I've both seen the destruction that I might be capable of, and I've been on the receiving end of other people's dark side. So let me tell you about mine first. I was part of a really large church. I got hired in, and very quickly, things got rearranged, and I became over the entire adult life department. And it was a department that had never really been developed. So I had all this space to grow and develop this department, and I started 3 major initiatives, and they were incredibly successful, and it was so fun and so great. So I was really surprised when I sat down with my supervisor, and he said, "You got to give up one of your teams." And I was like, what? No. I'm doing a great job. And he said, yeah, no one denies you are doing a great job. You still have to give up one of your teams. And I was so offended and so upset. And I'm like, why? And he could see something that I couldn't see, that I was starting to get stressed. My workload was like unmanageable. No one could continue at that level. And I was stressed, and even like resentment was starting to creep in. But I was just like, oh, I can't believe this is happening. And he said, okay, so I want you to go away and look over your teams and figure out which one makes the most sense for you to hand off to someone else. And I went home, and of course what I do, I grumble to Steve, and I'm like, this is ridiculous. And he looks at me and goes, well, I think he has a point. And he was, and my husband's very wise, and he was able to help me step back and say, if you continue at this pace, you are going to damage the thing that you've worked so hard to build. Like, you're going to undermine everything that you've done. You actually can't sustain the work that you've done. So this isn't about whether you've done a good job or a bad job. And I had to come face to face with this dark side of mine to realize, like, oh, my compulsive overachieving is eventually going to undo everything that I've wanted to do, all the work that I've done. And I am an overachiever, both by, I could see pride, selfishness, and self-deception. Like self-deception, I could run 3 major teams all the time for here, now, until eternity. No big deal, right? No, I couldn't. But also, my influence and experience. I grew up in a very demanding family that was incredibly high achieving, and that has become part of my ethos, right? And so left unchecked, I could have ended up hurting all the people that I had gathered and the teams that I had put together. And I'm very grateful to have wise enough people to help me step back and see my dark side at play before it did the damage that it could. Because again, I've been on the receiving end when that didn't happen. And so at a different church, I was hired, but to come in and make some changes. But the person who was in charge, he had great passion and great commitment to this organization. He had stepped in at one point when it was financially on the brink of ruin, and he had almost single-handedly saved this organization, right? So he had an incredible amount of ownership and commitment to how it was going to go, so much so that it started to move into an unhealthy level of ownership and commitment, to the point where, he had to oversee every decision. No decision could be made apart from him. And it turned into a bit of paranoia that, if I didn't know about it, then someone's working behind my back on purpose, right? And it led to the demand of unquestioning loyalty. You never question me, you must be loyal. And so we had this crazy relationship because I'd been hired, and he was excited, when he hired me because he thought, yes, I can see that we are moving towards decline. We need something new. I said, if you hire me, I bring change. Like this, I mean, you all experienced that, right, in 1 year. And I bring change. I generate work. Just want to be real clear. But he was really excited. Except for every change that I made, from the biggest to the smallest, he would just explode about it and come into my office. And I hadn't worked with people who yelled at me before, and I was being yelled at. I'm like, why am I being yelled at? At one point, we had all sat in a room and decided to paint a room in this organization, and he was there and helped choose the paint color. And then after it got painted, he blew up on another employee, and I went and talked to him about it. I'm like, what's happening? He said, well, it's like someone came in and painted my kitchen, didn't even ask me, to which I said, well, it's not your kitchen, and you were part of the conversation. But this was like, this ownership of needing to be in control is really what it boiled down to. And there were reasons, not excuses, right? And at some point, I knew this isn't going to work. Like this is becoming untenable. And what's interesting, I can relate to Joseph a little bit, because the day before everything blew up, God gave me this crazy dream, and I woke up, I'm like, I told him, I feel like this dream is about this, but I don't know how that could possibly be. And even walking in to work that day, I was like, I just feel like something like this is going to happen. And then it totally did, right? And so sometimes God gives us a little warning to be like, hey, something not so great's about to happen. I'm not causing it, but I'm in it with you, right? And in the end, he did wrestle back control. And what he did is he ran it into the ground as soon as he got it back. Because our dark side tells us, this is what I want. If I get this, I will be happy. But in the reality is, it won't fill that void. It won't meet that need. It just can't. Again, Macintosh and Riemann, they say, the truth is we all have a dark side, but they say this: it's important to remember that though the term dark side may conjure up negative images, our dark side is not intrinsically evil. It is simply part of being human. God can and does work through our dark side to accomplish his kingdom purposes and to elevate us to positions of leadership that we might not even have aspired to without the influence of our dark side. See, God's not like Steve. He's not quick to get rid of things. But you have a dark side. It's what you choose to do with it that matters. Look at the story again and notice what no one chose to do. Not a single person in Joseph's family chose to go to God with any of this. Jacob never chose to go to God with the pain of what it was to be rejected by Isaac. Instead, he passed it on. He continued passing on that generational sin and lived into it. Joseph didn't go to God with his dreams. His dreams were from God, but he didn't go to God with his dreams. What did he do? He saw it as self-aggrandizement. Like, I'm going to be in charge. And you all need to know that I had these amazing dreams. And the brothers, none of them went to God with their pain and their hurt. Instead, they assume if Joseph gains, then I lose. It's a zero sum, right? So we have to get rid of him because he's a threat to who we are. But again, just because you don't see something as having a use doesn't mean it's useless to God, right? God, this is the good news of this story. Like, imagine what the story would have been if one of them had turned to God, right? None of them did. They all go this selfish way, and God still doesn't get rid of them. God doesn't say, well, these jokers are done. Let's start again. Like, let's get a new batch of people who just aren't as terrible. He says, okay, I'm going to keep working with all the broken mess here. These broken people, this broken family, all these bad decisions. I'm going to continue to work because God is always at work, willing the greatest amount of good in any situation. Just because you don't see a use for it doesn't mean it's useless. And Joseph eventually sees that. And we'll get here in a few weeks, but at the end of the story, it's so important to know the end, even as we read through the rest of the story. Because at the end, Joseph does eventually reunite with his brothers. And this is what he says to them. He says, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. God can take something that was intended to harm and hurt and destroy, something that is not good, and he can turn it and make it into something good. He can work good through anything. God is always at work, willing the greatest amount of good. So God does not cause evil things. God is not in favor of evil choices. But nothing is outside of God's realm. God can work through anyone and anything. He's not quick to get rid of things. And so same with your dark side. it's what you choose to do with it. You might see all those things and you think these are useless. So I keep trying to hide them and push them away and get rid of them. Well, maybe they're useless in the form that they are right now, but God is in the business of transforming things. And so when we bring it to God, what you might not see a use for, God can eventually make into something useful. That's the whole point. Nothing is wasted in the kingdom of God. Nothing. Your pain, your bad decisions, your heartache, your suffering, God doesn't necessarily cause it, but he's not going to waste it. He will use everything to bring about redemption. That's what we see in Joseph, and that's what we see in our own lives. So what can we do to allow God to start to transform these things that maybe we feel like they're useless? Because it's not useless just because you can't see the use for it. There's 3 things and how our dark side can be redeemed. And it's acknowledge, examine, and surrender. So the first is to acknowledge. We need to accept that it's there. This is not about shaming yourself and, berating yourself for all the bad things that are part of who you are. It's just part of being human. We all have these things that are underdeveloped. We all have these wounds that we're carrying around. It's just part of it. And when we can turn and look at it and shine a light on patterns of behaviors or decisions and say, something here, I thought this was going to get me what I wanted, but it actually hasn't. And it keeps undermining everything that I want. When we step back and see what the shape of that dark side is. Are you constantly trying to keep people from being upset with you? All the time, so you'll do anything so no one's upset with you, right? Are you always overcommitting? And so someone wants to have lunch with you, and you're like, I'm not free for the next 5 months. So sorry, my calendar's already booked, and I already double booked 5 other things too. So are you that person who's just always saying yes? Are you controlling? Are you that person who's like, unless I know every detail and I know exactly what's going on, I'm not okay, right? Are you overly controlling? Do you naturally imagine doomsday events all the time? And you're like, well, if I plan it, if I imagine it, then it won't catch me by surprise. Like, all of these are dark side things. All of these are. So, it's just part of being human. So we have to acknowledge that it's there, but then we also have to examine. And examine is to see how it got there. We all have pride, selfishness, and self-deception, but what we're talking about is what are the influences and experiences that have shaped you? What feelings or experiences are you trying to avoid? What comments stuck with you when you grew up? Who are you still trying to please, whether they're alive or not, or someone that you even see anymore? And you're like, well, I still want them to accept me. They don't even know who I am or where I am. Is it that still that same middle school group of kids that you're like, if they accepted me, then I'd be acceptable? Right? Who are you still trying to please? And the truth is, these wounds happen in our families. They do. And sometimes we have bad families. And sometimes we have great families. But none of us have perfect families. Every family falls short. And it's the difference between intention versus impact, right? That just because someone had the impact that it hurt you didn't mean they intended to hurt you. For example, the other day I was cooking in the kitchen and suddenly all the lights went out. And I was like, what? Why are the lights out? And Steve turned around and he goes, oh, sorry, I hit the wrong switch. I'm like, well, can you put on the right one? He said, well, I didn't mean to hit the wrong switch. Like, the intention was not to turn off all the lights in the kitchen. The impact was that he did, right? And so when you think about intention versus impact, this is not about blaming people, right? That's not what we're here to do. We're not here to blame people. But if it stuck with you, it stuck, right? And so until you can name that thing that you're carrying around still, like Jacob never bothered to name how painful it was that what happened with Esau. And so what did he do? He passed it on. He kept living out of it, right? And if you don't stop and name it, you're passing it on too. It's just what happens. It is human nature, right? So it's not blaming, it's self-understanding. What are the expectations that are driving you, whether it's something that an expectation you've given yourself or an expectation from others? All of these things we have to look at, but here's the reality. Self-understanding will only take you so far. We live in a culture right now that loves therapy, and I'm a fan of therapy. I have benefited from therapy. Therapy will not free you. It is not the only thing that will free you. If self-understanding could free you, you'd be free. Jesus alone sets you free, right? So we need self-understanding. That's part of allowing God's grace to work in our life. Those of you who are counselors in this room, please don't be mad at me. I love you. I've come and seen you, in other seasons of my life. I'm not opposed to that. But we live in a culture that thinks that's enough, and it's not enough. because we need to surrender. We need to surrender to a God who is bigger than us, a God who knows more than we do, a God who is always on our side. And to surrender means that we trust. It means that we trust that God is at work. Because here's the thing, no amount of success is ever going to heal me, right? There's no amount of achievement where I will feel like I have arrived. That's not possible. That's not what will heal me. What will heal me is the grace and love and mercy found in Jesus. Again, Greg Boyd says, wherever we find ourselves and however we got there, we can know that God is already at work to bring good out of it. Those who place their trust in God are called to work with Him to bring redemptive meaning out of every event, however tragic it may be. Though our suffering may be the result of a multitude of free decisions, the suffering need not be meaningless. In the midst of all things, God is working with us for our good. Again, the reality is nothing is wasted in the kingdom of God. Nothing is wasted. And God has promised that everything is moving towards redemption. And that's the promise that Joseph is given in those dreams. He doesn't know what they mean. And we're going to see there's a lot more lows that Joseph is going to hit before the reality of those dreams come to pass. And when they come to pass, he will see them differently. He will see them differently. But that same promise goes before us, that God is already where you are. No matter your circumstances, no matter the pain, no matter the suffering, God is not absent from it. God isn't behind it. God didn't cause it, but God is in your midst, working for the greatest amount of good. Nothing is wasted in the kingdom of God. And so in your handout today, and if you didn't grab a handout, they're out there as well. But something we're starting for every series now, we're going to start having a verse that we're going to memorize together. And I'd encourage you to do that. There's something about putting the Word of God in our minds intentionally that allows God to work with our minds differently. And so this is the verse. And put it in your car. Put it on your mirror. Take a picture of it and tag us. Let us know where you're putting it. That's awesome, right? This is the verse I want all of us to cling to because it's the promise for us. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. No matter where you find yourself today, that is God's promise, and it goes before you. God might not have caused it, but God is not absent from it. God is in every circumstance working the greatest amount of good possible on your behalf. Why? Because He loves you. And so we can surrender everything to the God where we can really, truly find healing. Let's pray. Gracious God, we're so grateful for who you are. And we're so grateful for this reminder of your goodness. God, that you are always working the greatest amount of good in our lives. That there's nowhere that we can go that you are not present. That nothing is wasted. That you are not quick to get rid of things or get rid of people, no matter how bad our decisions are, or how many mistakes we've made. And God, that just because we might not see a use for it doesn't mean that it's useless. Because you are transforming us and changing us and healing us and setting us free. So give us the courage to acknowledge that dark side, to examine where it came from, and to surrender it to you so that you might do the work that only you can do. Because you've told us, Jesus, that you have come, and it's for freedom's sake that you have set us free. And so we're so grateful for that. Help us to live into that and cling to that, and to remember that we know that you work all things for the good of those who are been called according to your purpose and who love you. In Jesus' name we pray.